In 1858, along the muddy banks of the Tombigbee River in western Alabama, a scandal erupted that would obliterate one of the region's most esteemed planter families and expose the moral rot festering beneath the genteel surface of Southern society. At the Magnolia Heights plantation, a sprawling cotton empire of nearly 2,000 acres worked by 170 enslaved souls, Catherine Beaumont Jefferson, the 28-year-old wife of Colonel Marcus Jefferson, engaged in a liaison with Samuel, a 32-year-old enslaved man who tended the horses in the estate's stables. What followed was not merely a private transgression but a cataclysmic unraveling that would destroy lives, shatter reputations, and reveal the profound sickness at the heart of a system built upon the ownership of human beings. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South, stories that reveal how the institution of slavery corrupted not only its victims but also those who believed themselves its masters. Colonel Marcus Jefferson was 43 years old in 1858, a third-generation planter who had inherited Magnolia Heights from his father and expanded it through shrewd management and ruthless discipline. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and stern-faced, with gray threading through his dark hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to appraise everything and everyone as property to be inventoried. Educated at the College of Charleston, he fancied himself a philosopher-planter in the tradition of Jefferson and Madison, keeping detailed journals about agricultural methods, slave management, and the natural superiority of the Southern way of life. He served as a deacon at Sumter Creek Baptist Church, where he led prayers with the same commanding voice he used to order punishments in the fields. His reputation in Greene County was impeccable, a gentleman of learning, a defender of Southern honor, a man whose word was considered unshakable. He had married Catherine Beaumont in 1852, drawn to her delicate beauty and the considerable dowry her Charleston merchant father provided. She was 18 then, fresh from a finishing school for young ladies, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent, dark chestnut hair she wore in elaborate braids, and gray-green eyes that held a dreamy, distant quality. She played the pianoforte beautifully and could recite poetry in French, accomplishments that made her the ornament of Marcus's household but left her profoundly unprepared for the isolation and brutality of plantation life. The marriage had produced no children, a source of growing shame and tension in the household. Marcus consulted physicians in Mobile, who examined Catherine and pronounced her constitution sound, but perhaps too delicate for childbearing. The unspoken accusation hung in the air. She had failed in her primary duty. Marcus grew colder, spending more time overseeing the fields and less in her company. Catherine retreated into books and long walks through the grounds, accompanied only by Delilah, an enslaved woman of 45 who served as her personal maid and the closest thing she had to a friend in that lonely place. The great house at Magnolia Heights was a Greek Revival mansion with 6 towering columns across its front, surrounded by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss that swayed like mourning shrouds in the Alabama heat. Inside, despite the fine furniture imported from Europe and the crystal chandeliers that sparkled in candlelight, the house felt tomb-like to Catherine, a beautiful prison where she was expected to smile and perform her role as the perfect plantation mistress. Among the 170 enslaved people at Magnolia Heights, 8 individuals would become central to the tragedy that unfolded. Samuel was 32, a skilled horseman born on the Jefferson property, with strong features, intelligent dark eyes, and hands that were gentle with animals but bore the scars of the whip across his back from a punishment years earlier when he was caught trying to read. He worked in the stables, caring for the colonel's prized thoroughbreds and the carriage horses, a position of relative privilege that still meant he owned nothing, not even his own body. His wife Patience was 29, a woman of quiet dignity who worked in the laundry house and had borne 3 children to Samuel, though one had died in infancy. Tobias was 58, the head driver who enforced the colonel's will in the fields, a man broken by the system into becoming its instrument, his face lined with the weight of every punishment he had overseen. Young Moses was 19, a field hand with dreams of freedom that he whispered only in the darkness of the quarters. Esther was 24, a housemaid who cleaned the upper floors of the great house and observed everything with sharp, knowing eyes. Delilah, Catherine's maid, carried herself with careful dignity, speaking only when spoken to but missing nothing that occurred in the household. Benjamin was 41, the plantation blacksmith whose powerful arms shaped metal, but who could not forge his own freedom. And there was Grace, 16 years old, who worked in the kitchen house, and whose mother had been sold away when she was 7, leaving her with a permanent expression of wary sadness. The first meeting between Catherine and Samuel occurred in March of 1858, on an afternoon when early spring rain drummed against the stable roof and the smell of wet hay filled the air. Catherine had developed a habit of visiting the stables, ostensibly to check on her mare Artemis, but really to escape the suffocating emptiness of the house. Samuel was brushing down one of the colonel's horses when she entered, and for a moment their eyes met in a way that made them both look away quickly, sensing danger in that brief recognition of shared humanity. Over the following weeks, Catherine found more reasons to visit the stables. She told herself she was simply seeking company, someone to talk to about anything other than the weather and the correct way to arrange a dinner table. Samuel, for his part, understood the terrible risk but found himself unable to prevent the conversations that began to develop between them, moments when Catherine would ask his opinion on which horses seemed happiest or whether he thought the new foal would survive the summer. Pause for a moment and reflect on the profound inequality that made even kindness between them a dangerous transgression. In a world where one person owned another completely, where any interaction across the color line was scrutinized for signs of disorder, where the fundamental humanity of enslaved people was denied by law and custom, the simple act of conversation became revolutionary and terrifying. By late May, something had shifted. Catherine began arriving at hours when she knew the stable would be quiet, when the other enslaved workers were in the fields or occupied elsewhere. They talked about books, for Samuel had secretly taught himself to read despite the severe penalties for such knowledge. Catherine brought him volumes from the colonel's library, hidden in her shawl, and they discussed poetry and philosophy in whispered conversations that made them both feel, for those stolen moments, like something more than what the world had decreed they must be. Samuel spoke of his children, of his hopes that they might somehow know freedom. Catherine confessed her loneliness, her sense of being as much a possession as any slave, though she understood her suffering could never compare to his bondage. It was Catherine who first touched Samuel's hand, one afternoon in June, when thunder rolled across the Alabama sky and rain hammered the stable roof so loudly that they could barely hear each other speak. What followed was not rape or coercion in the conventional sense, but the encounter was still shaped by a power dynamic so fundamentally unequal that the very concept of consent becomes morally complicated. Catherine had the power to destroy Samuel with a word. Samuel had no right to refuse any white person's demands, and yet in those moments, they chose to reach for each other, to find in their union something that felt like mutual recognition and forbidden tenderness. The affair continued through the summer of 1858, occurring perhaps a dozen times in the stable's hidden corners, or once in the abandoned overseer's cabin near the edge of the property. Catherine convinced herself she had found love, that their connection transcended the evil system surrounding them. Samuel knew better. He understood that every encounter placed not only his life, but his family's safety in jeopardy, yet he could not resist the dangerous illusion of being seen as fully human by this woman who seemed to suffer in her own way from the plantation's cruelty. By August, Catherine realized she was pregnant. The timing and circumstances left no doubt about the child's paternity. Terror and strange elation warred within her. She confided in Delilah, who understood immediately the catastrophe this represented, and urged her mistress to end the affair and claim the child as the colonel's, to lie and pray and hope the baby's features would not betray its true parentage. But Catherine, in her naivete, or her defiance, or perhaps simply her exhaustion with pretense, could not bring herself to maintain the deception. In September, when she could no longer hide her condition, Colonel Jefferson expressed satisfaction that his wife had finally fulfilled her purpose. But Catherine's conscience, or her pride, or her desire to hurt the husband who had treated her with such cold indifference, would not allow her to accept his pleasure at what he believed was his achievement. On a sweltering evening in late September, after Sunday dinner when the colonel was drinking brandy in his study, Catherine told him the truth. She stood before him in her finest dress, her hands clasped, and spoke the words that would destroy everything. The child she carried was not his, and she named Samuel as the father. What followed in that study was not merely anger but a kind of madness, a rage so complete that it seemed to consume Marcus Jefferson's carefully constructed identity. He struck Catherine across the face, the first time he had ever done so, and when she fell to the floor, he stood over her breathing heavily, his face contorted with an emotion that went beyond personal betrayal to existential crisis. For a man whose entire sense of self rested upon his mastery, his control over his property and his household, this revelation represented total humiliation. His wife had chosen an enslaved man over him. An enslaved man had touched what belonged exclusively to the master. The racial and sexual hierarchies that justified the entire Southern social order had been violated in the most intimate and public way possible, for though it was not yet public, Marcus knew with certainty that it would become so. Scandal in the South spread like wildfire through the interconnected networks of churches, social calls, and business relationships that bound the planter class together. If you are watching this and wondering where such stories lead, subscribe to Shadows of the South so you never miss another investigation into the hidden histories that shaped America's most troubled region. Marcus Jefferson did not kill his wife that night, though part of him wanted to. Instead, he locked Catherine in her bedroom, posting Tobias outside the door with orders that she was to have no visitors except Delilah, who would bring her meals. Then he walked through the warm September darkness to the slave quarters, his boots crunching on the gravel path, and had Samuel dragged from his cabin, away from Patience and his terrified children. What occurred in the barn that night was a calculated destruction rather than a spontaneous beating. Marcus used a bullwhip himself, something he had not done in years, preferring to delegate such tasks to his overseers. He wanted Samuel to understand that this punishment came from him personally. The enslaved community heard Samuel's screams across the plantation grounds, a sound that made people shut their windows and pull their children close, and pray silently that the colonel's rage would burn itself out before he killed the man. After 50 lashes, Marcus stopped, not from mercy but from exhaustion. Samuel lay unconscious on the barn floor, his back a ruin of torn flesh. Marcus ordered Tobias to have him treated enough to survive, but then to sell him immediately to the harshest buyer available, someone who worked enslaved people to death in the swamps of Louisiana or the turpentine camps of Georgia. But selling Samuel proved more complicated than Marcus anticipated, for by the next day, the story had already begun to spread. One of the house slaves had overheard the confrontation in the study. Esther had whispered it to Grace, who mentioned it to her aunt in the laundry house, and by morning a dozen enslaved people knew that the colonel's wife had lain with Samuel the stable hand. In the complex social networks of the enslaved community, information traveled faster than masters ever imagined, and from the slave quarters, the story made its way to the white community through the whispered conversations between enslaved domestics and poor white deliverymen, through the indiscreet comments of overseers who enjoyed the spectacle of a planter's humiliation. Within 3 days, the rumor had reached Sumter Creek Baptist Church, where it was discussed in hushed tones after services and then carried into parlors and over dinner tables throughout Greene County. Pause and consider the bitter irony. While slaveholders routinely raped enslaved women and faced no social consequences, producing generations of mixed-race children whose very existence testified to white men's predatory behavior. A white woman's consensual liaison with an enslaved man threatened the entire social order. The hypocrisy revealed the system's true foundation, not morality or Christian virtue, but the maintenance of white supremacy and male control over female sexuality. The scandal unfolded with terrible inevitability. Reverend Ashford Whitfield, of Sumter Creek Baptist Church, called upon Colonel Jefferson, ostensibly to offer spiritual counsel but really to assess the damage and determine whether the church could continue to associate with a family so thoroughly compromised. Marcus received him in the study where Catherine had made her confession, and the two men spoke in careful euphemisms about unfortunate circumstances and the preservation of Christian community. What Reverend Whitfield meant, and what Marcus understood, was that Catherine would need to be sent away, the pregnancy terminated or the child disposed of once born, and Samuel sold or killed, to prevent his testimony from ever becoming a matter of legal record. The church could forgive much, even protect its own from scandal, but only if the appropriate steps were taken to restore order. Marcus's fellow planters were less diplomatic. Thomas Carruthers, who owned the neighboring plantation, and Henry Wainwright, a wealthy bachelor who controlled 3,000 acres in the next county, called upon Marcus together, a delegation that was both social call and judgment. They sat in the front parlor drinking Marcus's bourbon and spoke about the need to maintain standards, about how indulgence toward slaves and excessive gentility toward women created precisely these sorts of situations. One had to be firm, they suggested. A master could not show weakness or sentimentality. Their advice, delivered between sips of whiskey, was clear: get rid of the woman and the slave both, quickly and quietly, and in a year or two, the whole thing would be largely forgotten. Men would remember, but they would not speak of it openly, and Marcus could rebuild his reputation through proper remarriage and demonstration of his continued competence as a planter and community leader. But Catherine would not cooperate with her own erasure. When Marcus informed her through Delilah that she would be sent to a private asylum in Charleston, where she could remain until after the birth, and that the child would be given away immediately, Catherine refused. She sent word through Delilah that she intended to keep the child, that she would tell anyone who asked the truth about its parentage, and that if Marcus attempted to force her commitment or take her child, she would make such a public spectacle that his name would become a permanent source of ridicule throughout Alabama and beyond. It was a desperate gambit, an attempt to use the very scandal that destroyed her as a weapon of last resort. Marcus responded by tightening her imprisonment, allowing her no visitors except Delilah, and stationing guards to ensure she could not leave her room. In the slave quarters, Patience and her children lived in terror of what would happen next. Samuel had been sold within a week of the beating, sent to a buyer who asked no questions, and paid cash for damaged goods, destined for work that would likely kill him within a few years. Patience knew she and her children could be sold separately at any moment, a common punishment for the families of enslaved people who had transgressed. Moses, Tobias, Benjamin, Esther, Grace, and the other enslaved people at Magnolia Heights watched the unfolding crisis with a mixture of emotions. Some felt satisfaction at seeing a master brought low, others felt only fear about the increased surveillance and harsher punishments that would inevitably follow, and many felt deep sympathy for Patience and her children, who had done nothing wrong but would suffer regardless. Delilah, caught between her forced loyalty to Catherine and her understanding of the catastrophic consequences this scandal would have for the entire enslaved community, moved through the house like a ghost, speaking little and observing everything. By October, the story had spread throughout western Alabama and into Mississippi. It was discussed in county courthouses and general stores, in churches and on steamboat docks. Some people expressed outrage at Catherine's behavior, calling it proof of female moral weakness and the dangers of educating women beyond their station. Others whispered that Marcus had driven his wife to desperate measures through his coldness and neglect. A few, very quietly, suggested that perhaps the whole incident revealed something rotten about a system where human beings were treated as property, and sexual violence from masters toward enslaved women was so common as to be unremarkable, but such thoughts were dangerous, and most people focused their anger on Catherine for violating racial and social boundaries, rather than on the system that made such violence inevitable. The climax came in late November, during the week of Thanksgiving. Catherine, now 6 months pregnant, and still confined to her room, received word from Delilah that Marcus intended to have her forcibly committed to an asylum the day after Thanksgiving dinner, using the commitment papers signed by 2 compliant physicians who diagnosed her with moral insanity and hysteria. On Thanksgiving night, while the house was quiet and most of the enslaved people were in their quarters after a day of enforced celebration, Catherine picked the lock on her bedroom door using a hairpin, a skill she had learned from a novel and practiced in secret for weeks. She crept down the servants' staircase, past the kitchen house where Grace and 2 other enslaved cooks were cleaning up from the day's meal, and made her way to the barn where Marcus kept his agricultural chemicals and pest control supplies. What Catherine intended, we can only surmise from what followed. Perhaps she meant only to take her own life, to escape the asylum, and deny Marcus the satisfaction of erasing her. Perhaps she intended something grander, a destruction that would consume the whole rotten edifice of Magnolia Heights. What we know is that she took 2 bottles of turpentine and a box of matches, and she began in the barn, pouring the accelerant across the hay bales and wooden stalls. She lit the first match and watched the flames catch and spread with terrifying speed. Then she walked, flames rising behind her, toward the great house itself. Tobias saw the fire first, the orange glow lighting up the November darkness, and raised the alarm. Within minutes, enslaved people were running from the quarters with buckets, forming chains to the well and the nearby creek, trying to contain the blaze before it spread to the other outbuildings and the house itself. Marcus ran from the house in his nightshirt, screaming orders, his face illuminated by the firelight. He saw Catherine standing in the yard between the burning barn and the house, her white nightgown billowing around her pregnant form, another bottle of turpentine in her hand. For a long moment, husband and wife stared at each other across the firelit yard, the entire plantation community watching this final confrontation between master and mistress, between the man who had believed he owned everything and the woman who had discovered the only power left to her was destruction. Catherine did not speak. She walked toward the front porch of the great house, poured the remaining turpentine across the steps and the base of the columns, and lit another match. Marcus lunged toward her, but Benjamin the blacksmith, acting on some impulse of mercy or justice, or simply recognition of shared humanity, stepped between them, blocking Marcus long enough for Catherine to drop the match and watch the flames race up the porch. Then Catherine turned and walked into the fire, choosing her own death rather than submission to Marcus's will. Reflect for a moment on what drove a young woman to such an end, not merely guilt or shame, but the suffocating knowledge that she had no legal rights, no escape, no possibility of protecting her child or herself from a husband's absolute authority. The same system that enslaved Samuel and Patience and Moses and Grace had also enslaved Catherine, though in different ways, and her final act was both suicide and rebellion, self-destruction and accusation. The enslaved people of Magnolia Heights fought the fire through the night, saving the main structure of the house, though the front porch and 2 front rooms were destroyed, along with the barn and 2 storage buildings. Catherine's body was pulled from the flames by dawn, burned beyond recognition. Marcus survived physically, but something essential in him had been extinguished along with his wife and his reputation. The scandal was no longer mere gossip but a matter of public record, documented in newspaper accounts of the fire and Catherine's death. The Mobile Register ran a story in early December titled "Tragedy at Greene County Plantation," describing the events in carefully coded language that nonetheless made the truth obvious to any reader. In the aftermath, Colonel Marcus Jefferson began a rapid decline. He withdrew from church and social functions, spending his days in the half-burned great house, drinking and staring at the charred timbers of what had once represented his civilized status. The plantation's operations suffered as Marcus neglected his duties, and by spring of 1859, he was forced to sell parcels of land to cover debts. Patience and her children were sold at auction in March, separated as she had feared, each going to different buyers. Moses escaped during the confusion of the estate's partial dissolution, making his way north, though we have no record of whether he achieved freedom. Tobias, Delilah, Esther, Benjamin, Grace, and the others were scattered through sales over the following year as Marcus liquidated his holdings piece by piece. In September 1859, Marcus Jefferson was found dead in his study, a pistol in his hand, and a letter on his desk addressed to no one. The letter, which was suppressed by his executor, but remembered by those who saw it, allegedly contained no apology or explanation, but simply repeated one phrase over and over: "I could not master it." Whether he meant the scandal, his wife, his slaves, or the entire corrupt system he had been raised to defend, we cannot know. Magnolia Heights was sold at auction in October 1859 to a speculator from Mobile, who broke up the estate and sold it in parcels to smaller farmers. The great house eventually fell into ruin, consumed by fire again during the Civil War, though whether by accident or by deliberate burning from advancing Union troops, records do not say. Of Catherine's child, we have only fragments of information. Delilah, who was sold to a family in Montgomery after Marcus's death, reportedly told another enslaved woman years later that the baby, a boy, had been born on Christmas Eve 1858, while Catherine was still imprisoned in her room, attended only by Delilah herself. The child survived his mother by only a few days, dying of what Delilah called a failure to thrive, but what may have been deliberate neglect or even infanticide after Catherine's death. Marcus had the infant buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on the plantation grounds, refusing to acknowledge its existence. The boy had, according to Delilah's account, his mother's gray-green eyes, and his father's dark skin, a child who belonged to no world that 1850s Alabama recognized or could accommodate. Yet these stories matter because they reveal the human cost of America's original sin, the price paid in bodies and souls and generations for the wealth built on stolen labor. They remind us that the comfortable divisions between perpetrator and victim were never as clear as we might wish. Catherine was both victim of patriarchal control and participant in a system of racial oppression. Samuel was both victim, and in his intimate relationship with Catherine, someone who exercised a kind of dangerous agency. Marcus was both perpetrator of evil, and himself a product of a system that warped his understanding of morality and manhood from birth. Complexity does not excuse complicity, but understanding that complexity helps us reckon more honestly with how systems of oppression function and persist. The silence that surrounded stories like this for so long was not accidental but deliberate, an erasure that served to maintain simplified narratives about the past and avoid uncomfortable questions about continuity between past injustices and present inequalities. When we resurrect these stories, when we speak the names of the people involved and try to understand their choices and their suffering, we perform an act of historical justice, however belated. We say that their lives mattered, that what happened to them was not inevitable or acceptable, and that remembering their stories honors both their humanity and our obligation to confront difficult truths. The scandal of 1858, that brought down the Jefferson family, reveals what many Americans still struggle to acknowledge, that slavery was not a benign or paternalistic system, occasionally marred by individual cruelty, but a fundamentally evil institution that poisoned every relationship,
destroyed countless lives, and left scars that persist through generations. It shows us that power without accountability, whether the slaveholder's power over the enslaved, or the husband's power over the wife, inevitably leads to atrocity. And it reminds us that those who lived under such systems sometimes resisted, sometimes collaborated, sometimes simply tried to survive, but always remained human beings whose stories deserve to be told with honesty and respect. If you found this investigation into America's hidden history valuable, comment below with your thoughts on how we should remember and learn from these tragic stories. The past is not safely behind us. Its consequences shape our present in ways we are only beginning to understand. By confronting these difficult histories, by refusing to look away from the suffering and complexity they contain, we take a necessary step toward a more honest reckoning with who we have been and who we might yet become. Subscribe to Shadows of the South to continue exploring the stories the South tried to forget, because only by remembering can we ensure such evil is never repeated.